Hi everyone, this is Grace, and today I'll be walking you through how I made this beginner Christmas set, so let's go. Now, I designed this set with beginner cookiers in mind, beginner at-home cookiers, so I did everything I could to make it more accessible for those at home, and the number one thing I did is that in this entire set uses one consistency. You heard that right. It is my thick flood. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go check out my video on consistencies. And yeah. All right. So, right. The second thing I did, how could I forget, is that they're all circles. It's 10 designs, I can't count, on circles. I mean, you can make a circle with a water glass. Like, hello, so easy. So, we're going to start off with this little wet on wet tree situation. I did my best with all of the designs to not compromise on design, aesthetic, just because we're doing one consistency. Now, maybe this is kind of a tricky one to start off with because certainly wet on wet with a thicker consistency is more challenging for sure because you just have less time to work with it. But we're going to do this little swirl of a tree. The closer you make the lines, the harder it is, the farther apart, the easier it is just because you have fewer to do. If this looks kind of messy, that's okay because you're going to take a scribe or a toothpick in a hot second and pull that through the center. You could even do probably like a couple of pulls, but I like to do the one clean pull. Move as fast as you can. That's the name of the game with wet on wet so that you get your icing to settle flat. Let that crust pretty nicely, and then we're using this yellow here. You know what? I lied, friends. Oh my goodness. Brain fart. So there are two consistencies. I completely forgot. But each color only comes in one consistency. So that yellow is actually an extra thick flood, and so is the black that we're using. If you end up making a flood, not like a thick flood, not the end of the world. I went for extra thick instead of like a piping consistency because I still wanted it in like the same family of consistency. Although now that I think about it, maybe that made it more challenging. Just doing like a piping and then a flood. I don't know. Sometimes my brain makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. Anywho, so what are we doing now? Oh, this is another wet on wet. Apparently I'm taking my precious time to, get my scribe out there. You want to make sure that you just, fill in all the holes, but you do not want to spend forever messing with it right now because that just takes away time on your wet on wet. So, dear lovely friends, don't do what I'm doing. I'm finessing this too much. Come on, Grace. We're working against the clock here. So we're going to grab our green and we're just going to do a bunch of dots, pretty large dots. I'm very systematic in my placements, so that's why I kind of split half and half. I always split spatially down the middle. That's how I can eye things best. And then I found it was helpful to just kind of give each dot a little bit of encouragement to settle because when there's too much icing kind of sitting on the top, it would just not make the pulls look as nice, in my opinion. It would have like too much icing on the scribe, if that makes sense. So you're just going around once here. And then take your red, and I did 3 sets of 3, but you can really do whatever you want for the little holly berries. It's holly, right? Yes. I don't know. I'm doubting myself. Oh man. All right. So that is the second cookie. Up next, I think, we're rocking Santa. So the other thing that I did my best to represent with these cookies, with this set, is that you do not need to make the red and the black super saturated, even the brown. I would say these are the 3 of the most common colors to oversaturate, and when you oversaturate, you use too much food coloring, and it really messes with the consistency of the icing, and you don't know that until it dries, unfortunately. So believe it or not, this is actually not a super saturated red. You always want to make sure that you allow your colors to develop, but especially red and black and even brown. Black, I always make the day before. And if you're really struggling with putting too much food coloring in black, I'd even recommend starting it like 2 days before. I recognize at this point this does look pretty black. My biggest tip, other than letting the color develop, so it just needs time to sit and darken, so you don't want to color it all the way to black in the bowl. You want to make it like a dark gray. My second biggest tip is that if it is already black in the bowl, it is too dark. It will continue to darken as it's sitting in the bag, as you're decorating, as it's drying. So if it's already black in the bowl, it's gone too far. You want it to be a very, very, very dark gray in the bowl, and just trust the process, my friends, and I swear it will get there. So this black here is that extra thick flood that I mentioned. This is my own kind of terminology here. Right, this is why I didn't want to do piping consistency, because I could do this shape with like a soft peak, but if you don't have just the right consistency, it would be such a disaster to try to do that thick black stripe. And then this yellow here, again, is that extra thick flood. Again, just like a little bit thicker than the flood we're using. And I'm doing like a pressure piping here, where I'm just basically doing like a flood technique, but with a slightly thicker icing. Instead of doing like an outline and flood for this section thing, whatever this is called, the buckle, that's what it's called. I didn't feel like there was quite enough icing to give it a poof, so I added a little bit more on top. There we go. Et voila, there is Santa's buckle. That's one of those where obviously it's like not Santa's face, which would definitely be harder to do, but this evokes Santa, and sometimes with cookies, that's all you need. Now, next up, we have one of our white bases. This is going to end up being the Snowman. Now, for white, I do recommend adding white gel food coloring, or white powder like the Sugar Art Master Elites. That does two things to your white. Number one, it just makes it a brighter white. Pretty much no matter how you make your icing, it's going to be kind of an off-white. Obviously, if you're using like vanilla extract, it's really going to be off-white. I use lemon juice to flavor mine, so mine is also still off-white. If you want to get a bright white, use that food coloring. And then a lot of people say that it helps with color bleed, to prevent color bleed, in other words. So this is my extra thick black here. My mom thought that the mouth dots were not close enough together. So you could make them closer. You could use more of them, but I don't know. I was going for kind of cartoonish. And that little simple carrot nose. So you might have noticed that it's like a golden yellow, and I did that very intentionally because the buckle and obviously the star really needed to be yellow, but the carrot is like orange. So my compromise was to make a golden yellow. You can do that by starting with yellow and then adding just a touch of red icing. I wouldn't add red gel coloring because chances are you're going to add way too much of it. But if you add just a little bit of your red icing, then you'll get kind of a little more golden. And that's one of the tricks I like to use with a color palette for a set, is sometimes it's just not worth it to make an entirely new color for one tiny little detail. So to make orange for that carrot was just not worth it. So I figured out how I could compromise by making a orangish golden yellow. And in the context of that snowman design, you know it's the carrot nose, right? Like no one's going to question that. Moving on to this reindeer here, Rudolf, the red-nosed reindeer. We have the brown. which we let crust. And if you're really on top of things, let it just barely crust before you move on to the nose. That will help prevent craters in the nose. But when you're a super beginner, like, don't worry about craters. Craters are going to happen. It's inevitable. And you can certainly change the expression on this reindeer. I know he looks kind of like sad and dopey, but you can make him like happier. And that just is changing the eyebrows and the reflections on the eyes. Next up, trying to figure out where we're at. I'm gonna hazard a guess that this is the peppermint. This is the one problem with doing these like shape series, is that I don't always know what I'm starting with because they're all circles, right? So this set also, I mentioned shape series, is kind of like an ode to my more complicated shape series. Just this idea to show you that, you know, you don't have to get fancy with your cookie cutters. Get creative, use a color palette that makes sense, do some designs, even if they just evoke the essence of whatever you're going for. Yes, okay, I made a bajillion different tests of this peppermint, and I'm still like, nah, is it really like a classic true peppermint? Not exactly, but it's close enough. And it really does look like, whatever, it looks close enough. You could do like more spins, you could make this messier, whatever, but I was going for close enough, right? So everyone knows this is supposed to be peppermint, at least I think so. So then this is totally optional. I added just a little sprinkling of large white sanding sugar. It's just a sprinkling. It's not meant to like cover the whole thing. I don't know. I liked the addition. Okay. And then I think next up, this is the elf. Again, this is not like an elf face. It just kind of evokes the essence of the elf. And we're starting with this green here, which I'm trying to remember how I actually colored this green. I want to say this is a green more on the yellow side. But you know what? Maybe just ignore what I'm saying because I honestly don't remember. Okay. The general idea, though, with this whole color palette is I was trying not to make anything too saturated. I find with beginners, especially, there is a tendency to use too much gel coloring because, again, it goes back to wanting the color to look exactly what you want it to look like in the bowl. But you have to trust the process, trust that it's going to get darker. I know that was definitely one of my issues when I was first decorating. Yeah, so with this design here, I chose to do the full base in green and then add the red on top, but a lot of people would do this kind of design not in 2 layers, like do the green first or the red, whatever. Like do it in just 1 layer so it's kind of cut out, if that makes sense. I think a lot of people do that because I think there's too much icing when you do 2 layers like this. I personally don't think that's a problem, but that's just me. So, yeah. Also, I just think it's easier to execute it this way. I think those little cutouts can be a bit more challenging. And again, if you're doing the 2 layers and you're really on top of it, do that second red layer when the first one has just barely crusted. Let's see what we're moving on to now. I would guess this is the Christmas lights, but let's see if we get there. By the way, my cookie looks a little shiny. I've had people say it's undercooked. It's not undercooked. I just roll out my cookie dough with, what do I roll it out with? Powdered sugar. Yes, thank you. I used to roll my cookies out with, flour, which is what most people do, but I find that the recipe I use just gets very easily gets too much flour. So I prefer powdered sugar, but sometimes it just looks extra glossy like that, which is okay. So next up, right, we're doing the snow. Oh, it's the snowflake. Duh, Grace. This is not, okay, clearly not Christmas lights. So you want to make sure that first base layer is pretty well dried, because we're going to do a little sprinkling of sanding sugar on top of this. And if your base layer is still kind of like damp in a way, the sugar crystals will just stick to it, which is not a look. Now this is another one where we are going for a sprinkling. I didn't want to cover it. I just wanted to sprinkle. Largely because it's the large size sanding sugar. If you try to actually cover all of those lines with the size large sanding sugar, it would lose the definition of the design. If you're going to cover the whole piping design, then I would use a small size sanding sugar. Right, we have the gingerbread man up next. Cutie patootie cakes. What else can I say? This brown is a chocolate brown from Americolor. If you're struggling with brown, the Sugar Art Master Elite's True Brown is a really great option for brown too. Ooh, another tip for rolling out circles, because circles can be the bane of many people's existence, including mine. So the general idea is that you can do this before you bake the cookies, which is what I do, or you can do it when they're fresh out of the oven. Pause for a second. So unlike the dots that we did for the wreath, these are not injected dots. These are like dots on the surface, and that's because they're bigger than the green dots for the wreath. And when you inject the icing, you add a lot more icing than what I was doing here, which is just to add more icing to the surface. Going back to, the circles. So if you have available to you a circle that is slightly larger than the one that you cut out, when you place them on the cookie sheet or when they're literally fresh out of the oven, you can take that larger circle and put it down around the dough and kind of circle it around, and it'll move the dough around the larger circle, and that will make your circles better. If you do it a little too aggressively, then it will make the cookie a lot smaller. I certainly did that a couple of times. Whoops. But yeah, I prefer to do mine on the baking sheet rather than fresh out of the oven, but to each their own. Okay. I do believe we are actually on to the last cookie now, which is the Christmas lights. So, doodly-doo. I'm not sure what else to say. This Christmas lights, so just kind of like speaking to some of my design, I had originally done three strings of lights, but when I looked at it, I was like, it looks a little too busy for the aesthetic of the rest of the set, because as you can tell, the set is very simple. I really simplified everything. That's why with the snowman, I liked the fewer dots for the mouth as opposed to more. So for this, I'm going for just 2 strings and pretty large. I saw these as lights, but I don't know. They kind of look like ornaments too. Whatever. They can be lights, they can be ornaments, whatever strikes your fancy. You can also just leave them as dots. You don't have to do this part. But the idea is you're piping a dot, using both. You've got the thick flood for the red and the green, and then the extra thick flood for the yellow. And then pretty quickly take that scribe or toothpick and kind of pull the tip down. Obviously kind of important to do this when that white is pretty well crusted. Oh, and sidebar, I do recommend letting the black line dry before moving on to the dots. Since everything is kind of on the thinner side, like a flood, your dots can just melt into the line a little too much. So that's it. That is the whole set. Such a great beginner set for at-home cookiers. I really, really hope this set in particular, you give it a try at home. You don't have to make all 10 designs. You can make whichever ones you like the best. You can even add ones if I left some out. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have a sweet one.